both accounts very quickly and explain what they have to say, because this is necessary background as to what we are doing today. And I'll just read, starting with, Matthew 19, starting with verse 3, and we're going to read from 3 to 9. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who has created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." And they said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?" And he said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way. But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for," and we got that word again, porneia, "and marries another woman, commits adultery." So again, what Jesus has just said is that whatever Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 meant, and whatever application it had, it is no longer applicable. He has abrogated it. He nullified it. He canceled it. He nailed it to the cross. It is no longer applicable, and it is not meant for us to take any kind of theological application today. When what Moses allowed, Jesus no longer allows. He said no, and he meant it. He also then said in verse 9, he says that if a man divorces his wife except for the fornication clause, if she has been guilty of porneia, then he himself is guilty of mokaia, adultery, and anyone that marries her is guilty of mokaia as well. It is an exact harmony to all else that Jesus has taught. The second account of that same meeting, which you're going to read, if you look up with me, please. Now go ahead and start. You can catch up with me. On Mark 10, and we're going to read from verses 2 to 9. Some Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him, and began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce his wife. And he answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" And they said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." And Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." Now that is the second account. And in both cases, Matthew was written to the Jews. And so Matthew cherry-picked what was most applicable to who he was writing to. So he referred to the Jewish betrothal custom. Mark was writing to the Gentiles. And so therefore, since the betrothal custom was not widely spread in Gentile circles, he did not refer to it. But they were both saying exactly the same thing. What Moses had written is no longer applicable, and Jesus removed the bar. And what that means is that our bar is not simply higher than what the Old Testament bar. There is no limit to it. We are to obey God and in his original creation commandment concerning marriage. Now there is a third meeting that Paul might have been referring to, and that is the one that was held privately in a house with his disciples on the same day after this public meeting took place. And we have an account of that. We have two accounts of that. One adds to the other, and the account starts with Mark 10 verses, and we're going to read 10, 11, and 12, and then we're going to go directly to Matthew 19 verses 10, 11, and 12. Starting with Mark, in the house the disciples began questioning him about this again, and he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another woman, she is committing adultery." And we'll go now to the Matthew account, Matthew 19, starting at verse 10. The disciples said to him, "If the relationship of a man and his wife is like this, it is better not to marry." They had no trouble getting that, by the way. They understood that. But he said to them, "Not all men can accept this statement," meaning the statement that they had just said, "is better not to marry, but only to those to whom it has been given." And he went on, "For there are eunuchs who were born that way from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who is able to accept this, let him accept it." What Jesus was just saying here is that anyone who divorces, and that's anyone, and that's everyone, and that's every man for all time, that divorces his wife and marries another, commits wakaya, adultery, the punishable adultery of sin. Thou shalt not commit adultery. And any woman, in the same way, that divorces her husband, commits wakaya, adultery. And the disciples went on to say, well, if that's the case, then it's probably better not to marry. And Jesus said, in effect, well said. But not everybody will not choose to marry. Some will not choose to marry because of some very good physical reasons, or some very good spiritual choices, or because they haven't met anybody that turns them on, whatever. But in either case, if they do get married, let them accept this teaching. It's not optional. Paul may have been referring to those. He may also have been referring to what Luke ended up recording, and that is found in Luke 16, verse 18. And I'll read it. Luke 16, verse 18. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. Wakaya. Very clear. Now, with that little bit of background, we have a further reading as to what Paul's understanding was, whether he received the teaching passed down by the apostles that recorded Jesus' words, or whether he received it directly from Jesus Christ. We also have it in Romans 7, 1-3. Now, let me explain. 1 Corinthians was written before Romans. So, in between the time that Jesus taught Paul, or Paul was taught by the apostles what Jesus' doctrine was on this subject, and 2 years after Corinthians, we have Paul's complete understanding as to what he believes that Jesus Christ taught. If you turn, please, to Romans 7, 1-3. I'll read it from the New American Standard Bible. Or do you not know, brethren? For I am talking to those that know the law. I'm just going to stop there for a minute. He's not talking about Old Testament law, for this is not Old Testament law. This is New Testament commands. This is Christian law as laid down by Jesus Christ. And this is also what was commonly accepted in the church. You see, Paul is using this as an illustration as to the differences between being under the law and being under grace, between those that know of him and those that just simply have an externals on him. It's talking, and he's using the illustration of the permanence of marriage because it is something that all of his hearers that understand the law of Christ understand. It's the law of marriage. So I'll go back. I'll begin again. Or do you not know, brethren, for I am speaking to those that know the law, that the law has jurisdiction over a person as long as he lives. For the married woman is bound by law to her husband while he is living. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law concerning her husband. Verse 3. So then, if while her husband is living, she is joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress, though she is joined to another man. This is pretty well proof positive of what Paul's understanding was as to Jesus' New Testament law and the eternal law that was started in the book of Genesis for all people, for all time, for all sons of Adam, and for all daughters of Eve regarding marriage. So it is highly unlikely that between the time that Paul heard Jesus' words, whether directly or indirectly given to him, and the time that he wrote Romans, that somehow or other he deviated. So I think that we will find in context that all of Romans chapter 7 fall within those teaching guidelines. Now, in Romans 1 Corinthians chapter 7, you will find that for the first part of the chapter, it's concerning those that are unmarried. And now he begins to discuss various questions that were submitted to him by the Corinthian church. And in all of the teachings that were taking place between 1 Corinthians 7:10 and the balance of the chapter, Paul laid out two cornerstones. Consider them perhaps to be like goalposts. if you're playing soccer,